Big news for anyone who loves the history of D-Day. Matt McLachlan Battlefield Tours has just launched a brand new tour that visits the D-Day beaches and lots of other sites in rural France, and all from the comfort of a luxurious cruise on the Seine River. Now, we ran this tour in 2024 and it was a huge success. It sold out in a matter of weeks. So now we've rolled it out again for 2025. But this time, there'll be 3 departures in June, July and September, giving you 3 times the opportunity to join us. The cruise is on board the luxurious Amadeus Diamond and begins and ends in Paris. Over 8 days, you'll enjoy the history, scenery and culture of the beautiful Seine River. But as an exclusive offering just for our passengers, you'll enjoy 2 full days touring the D-Day landing beaches in both the US and British sectors, plus daily seminars on board the ship that unpack the history of D-Day. And like all our tours, you'll be hosted by one of our expert historians who'll bring the story of D-Day to life. And if you've been on one of our tours before, you'll know that our historians really are the best there is. This is an exclusive cruise and places are extremely limited. Visit battlefields.com.au to book your place today.
Outdoor adventures often come with a side of itch. That's why you need Sarna Calm and Cool. Sarna Calm and Cool provides the soothing care your skin needs. Sarna Calm and Cool lotion relieves itch and pain from insect bites, sunburn, and poison ivy with 1% pramoxine hydrochloride and 0.5% menthol. Did you know Sarna is the #1 dermatologist-recommended topical anti-itch brand? Learn more at sarnalotion.com today.
Ryan Reynolds here for, I guess, my 100th Mint commercial. No, don't. I mean, honestly, when I started this, I thought I only have to do like 4 of these. I mean, it's unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month. How are there still people paying 2 or 3 times that much? I'm sorry, I shouldn't be victim blaming here. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch. Whenever you're ready.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
A Living History production.
I'm Matt McLachlan.
And I'm Pete Smith.
We're battlefield historians who love nothing better than getting out and walking the ground where great battles in history took place.
And now we'd like you to come with us. Every week, BattleWalks will take you to one of the great battlefields of Europe.
As we walk the ground, we'll dig through the pages of history. We'll uncover the secrets of the battlefields, and most importantly, we'll tell the stories of the people who fought and died there.
Welcome to BattleWalks.
Hello and welcome to BattleWalks as we stroll across the great battlefields of Europe. I'm Matt McLachlan, and joining me once again is a dear friend and a great historian. It's Pete Smith. Pete, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Matt. Great to be here again.
Today, mate, we are heading back to the Somme, a place we've touched on a couple of times in the podcast so far. But this is really your stomping ground, isn't it? We're going to the village of Flers, a place that you know very, very well. Tell us all about the walk that we're going to do today.
Well, it's where I live, so it's a walk I do on a regular basis. What I thought we'd do is basically start at one end of the village and walk to the other end. We're not going to particularly concentrate on the fighting in 1916 or the fighting in 1918. We're going to do a general overview of what happened to the village at the various phases of the Great War. We're going to start at a place called, now you'll have to excuse my French here, a Rideau de Fillois. I think that's how you pronounce it, which is basically about half a kilometre outside of the village, and it's on the right-hand side, and the village is in front of it. We're looking towards the village. We have Delville Wood behind us, very famous for the South Africans. This windy little road, quite open, no woods on the road, and we're going to start with this, where this little mound is on the right-hand side, and then walk through the village.
What I love about this, Pete, and it's what I'm really enjoying about battle walks that we've been doing so far, is this is not a walk along the front line for the first day of the Somme or the Battle of Pozières for the Australians or Villers-Bretonneux. This is a lesser known but still very important site on the battlefields. And it's a site that I think people, when they're touring the battlefields, might not necessarily spend a lot of time in. And I think it's wonderful that we have this opportunity to dig deeply into this history, to tell some stories, perhaps some unknown chapters of the First World War history.
It's a very important little location for one major, I suppose, fact, and that is this is where tanks were very first used. In fact, the village of Flers was the first village to be captured by tanks. So for those that are interested in the tank corps and the heavy branch machine gun corps, as it was called at that time, then this is a must come and have a look at. But for a lot of others, it is a byline, a sideshow of the front line. And in fact, the fighting here on the 15th of September 1916, when it was taken, was fairly tough, but using these tanks. And then it's more a case of holding the line for that terrible winter of 1916-17. So we'll be discussing that horrible winter of 16-17, coldest for 40 years. So not a pleasant place to be.
And once again, the village of Flers really sums up. Firstly, it demonstrates the length of the First World War, the static nature, that the war did not move particularly far in terms of geographic terms over a very long period of time, but also the collaborative effort from the Allies, because there are fascinating stories in and around this village to do with British troops, New Zealanders, South Africans, Australians, because of that terrible winter you discussed. To me, it's a beautiful little encapsulation of just these myriad of convoluted stories that really define the First World War.
Correct. And the first one that we're going to start with is actually the story of the French, because in 1914, this is where the story starts of the fighting around our village. It's been held by the French, and on the 26th of September 1914, the Germans arrive in their rush to the coast, and there is fighting through the village. It's fighting that's light from the point of view of what's going to come later on. So houses would be windows smashed, some damaged, some roofs taken off, but effectively the village is still there. It's overrun by the Germans on that date, the 26th of September. It's not held. In fact, it's the French territorial part-time soldiers who are trying to hold the village, the 82nd Territorial Division of the French Army. Unsuccessful. And one of the things we're going to pass on the walk is a memorial to them. There is a memorial to the French fighting here in 1914, but sadly it's unsuccessful fighting. The Germans carry on their rush towards the coast and eventually being stopped close to Amiens. In fact, just Amiens itself was captured at that time. But the village is intact, and the village is actually then going to be used by the Germans as a rear area. So they're going to use it for training troops. The church is converted into a field hospital. So it's very much something that's going to be incorporated into the German positions. Hence, the villagers are removed. Those that didn't leave when the Germans arrived are going to be removed by the Germans and taken to camps in Belgium, where they'll be refugees, effectively.
And what was the story of Flers in later parts of the war? So obviously during the later stages of the Battle of the Somme, Flers was pivotal as the scene of the first use of tanks. And when we say the first use of tanks, we don't just mean in the First World War or on the Western Front. We mean in history. This was the first time that the very new invention, the tank, was used in combat. So quite an extraordinary connection with history there in the village of Flers. But tell us a bit more about what the village was involved in into 1916, 1917, and indeed 1918, and then we'll take a stroll through the town. Okay,
well, in 1916, then obviously this is where the tanks are used, and in fact it's famous mainly because of a newspaper article and a telegram actually that went out around the world and was used by the press. And the headline was, "A tank is walking up the high street of Flers with the British Army cheering behind." And it's a bit of an exaggeration, to put it mildly. The tank obviously isn't walking, but nobody really knew how tanks moved. Obviously the people involved and the infantry who'd been briefed and had sometimes trained not a great deal, you have to say at this point, to work with tanks, but they weren't sure, so they decided to use the term walking. Yes, the infantry cheering on behind it. Yes, again, probably a minor exaggeration, but nevertheless, it was successful. A tank did walk up the main street of Flers on the 15th of September 1916, so it's a famous day. The village is then going to be just behind the front line for that terrible winter of 16-17, and then the Germans will withdraw back to the Hindenburg line. So this becomes then 10, 12 kilometres or more behind the line. So it's a realigned village again. Not that there's much left of it. The village itself had been almost swept away by our artillery fire prior to the attack on the 15th of September 1916. So very much flattened, not a great deal left. In fact, one of the British official artists, drew some sketches around here, so you can have a look at those. I'm sorry, I can't actually remember what he's called. It doesn't matter really, but it's a safe place to be. And then again, sadly, in 1918, the Germans are going to be back in their spring offensive. They're going to overrun this area again, some quite heavy fighting, and that will basically see the absolute ruination of anything that was left. There will be nothing left here whatsoever. So, and finally, the village will be damaged yet again in that final push in the 100 days as we overrun the German positions and force them back towards the end of the war. So, at that point, there is nothing left. We are left with nothing, and I'm going to describe the village in more detail as we walk into it.
Pete, isn't it extraordinary that, as I touched on before, I think Flers is a place that many people would never have heard of. Perhaps only if they're interested in the tank warfare, or if they are interested in that bitter winter of 1916, 1917, they may have heard of Flers. But for most people, this is not a village that would spring to mind. And yet, what a rich history. It just shows that every facet of the First World War involved a myriad of stories and history, didn't it?
Oh, indeed so. And this village, perhaps more so because of that use of tanks than many villages in this area. And of course, like all of the villages in this area, it is going to be flattened and swept away entirely. And it's actually something that's very hard, even though I've lived here now for nearly 20 years, to envisage a village that had gone in its entirety. Even the bricks had been reused. The bricks left from the remains of the houses were going to be used for the roadworks. The timber had been used for revetting or just for firewood. So there literally was nothing here. This was a village that had ceased to exist totally. And it's just really hard to get your head around it when you walk up and down through these streets, because it was rebuilt exactly as it had been, and some of it not so well built. So it looks like it's been here for hundreds of years, but it hasn't. It's been here for 100 years or less, because most of it wasn't completed, the rebuilding, till 1927. That's the date that's emblazoned on the front of my property, 1927.
I think it's great that you mentioned the total destruction of the village, Pete, because we've had a couple of requests through social media for us to talk about the Zone Rouge, the red zone that describes this area of the Western Front that was completely destroyed during the war and had to be rebuilt from scratch. And Flers obviously fits fairly squarely in the middle of that zone, doesn't it?
It does indeed, and the Zone Rouge is an interesting concept. It's a French concept which had been discussed, and really it was an idea to preserve, not in that sense of preserving it as a battlefield, just to preserve the landscape that had been fought over heavily. And there are multiple reasons, but you have to say the most important one was the danger to human life and people coming back, mainly from the explosives that were everywhere, live shells, live rounds, grenades, everything. And there still are. I mean, they're still being ploughed up to this day, all over this landscape. But there was also a worry that we can perceive connected with nuclear and biological and chemical warfare. But at that time, nobody really knew what gas was going to do long term. But there'd been massive amounts of gas used on the whole length of the First World War. So there was a worry. What is it going to be like for people if they move back into these areas? Will they be able to live there? Should this landscape be left as it is? And certainly, if you go into the big French sectors around Verdun, there are great tracts of land that have been left exactly as they were. Here, that's not going to happen, and it's partly a mistake, really, for the British, we are in charge of this area. For British, I mean the Empire forces, we are in charge of this area here, and we didn't stop the farmers from coming back. And effectively, as in the 100 days in 1918, as we force the Germans back, then the civilian population comes in behind us, and they start to fill in the shell holes and level the landscape and try to put temporary accommodation up. And it was felt, once this had happened, it was felt that even for the French government of the time, it would be political suicide to now try and push these farmers back off and say, no, we're not having this land. This land is being preserved as it is. It's seen as too dangerous. It's seen as an area that should be kept partly as a memorial to all of those that were lost here. So Zone Rouge does not exist in this area. There's an interesting aspect of that. Have there been soil tests done in the areas where it has been left? And yes, there have. Is the soil contaminated? Yes, it is. It's very much contaminated by heavy metals, the lead in the ball bearings from the shrapnel shells, and also from the explosives. You're getting residues left in the ground that are difficult for us to well, it would affect us. It would affect us in our food. So you have to say here, is there an issue here? Well, I'd have to say, yes, there probably is. Have there been many tests of the landscape here? I'm not sure. I think if they did, they would find that there was a problem. But certainly potatoes and other vegetables and animal food is grown here, and there doesn't appear to be any issue connected with it. But it does make you wonder when you're looking at the landscape and realising it is the same as the landscape around Verdun.
Well, it's a fascinating place, Pete. So let's jump in. Let's do a walk through your village of Flers. Where are we going to begin?
Well, we're going to start at this place. You're going to make me say it again now, aren't you? The Rideau de Fillois. The Rideau de Fillois, we're going to start alongside here, and it's an interesting little location, mainly because it was photographed to such an extent, because one of the very first tanks that walked up the high street of Flers, will turn round and come back with its engine knocking like mad. There was obviously something very wrong with the engine, and the commander decided, Lieutenant Stuart Hasty decided that he needed to get out of the village before it broke down completely. And this is where he got to. He basically pulled in here before the thing completely seized up, and this is where it remained for the next, well, I don't know exactly how long, but certainly a few days, possibly longer. And it was used as a brigade HQ by many of the units operating in the area in the start of that winter until it was repaired and then eventually left the area, and it was well photographed. So I always like to start my walks as we walk through the village here, because it's just a place that is quite well known to those that like photographs of that first day of the use of tanks. From here, we're going to walk towards the village. And the next thing that we're going to come across is this memorial I've already mentioned, the French memorial. It's on the right-hand side, just beyond the sign that says Flers, or Flers. And it's a fairly big obelisk in granite, and it's commemorating the 82nd Territorial Division, much underviewed, underutilised, undermentioned, because as we've been discussing, not that many people come to Flers. And if you do come to Flers, then obviously you're interested mainly in the Empire and the British experience. We don't think about the French in 1914 a great deal, and so it's not really commented upon, and it needs to be, because there are very few memorials to the French in this area in 1914. So in fact, I can't think of another one within striking distance. So it's a well worth having a look at that.
It's one of the great injustices of the First World War, Pete, that we don't mention the French enough. We don't account for their contribution nearly enough. Even when I was describing the nationalities that fought in the village of Flers, even I didn't mention the French then. So it's a very Anglo-American way of looking at the First World War, is to overlook the contribution of the French, and perhaps it's to do with what happened in the Second World War, and again our somewhat distorted view of the cheese-eating surrender monkeys, as the Simpsons called them. The French have been tarred by this impression of what went on in the Second World War, and I think that permeates into the First World War as well. But it's completely unfair. The French were not only a vital component of the fighting on the Western Front in the First World War, they carried the bulk of the load through large sections of the war. So I think it's fantastic that at this spot, when we stop here, we think not just about the French who fought in this village, but the French in general and their massive contribution to victory on the Western Front.
I agree entirely, and I have to say that we're terrible at it. When I say we, I'm really talking about the British, because our favourite day of the First World War, our commemorative day, really, that we remember more than any other, the 1st of July, the terrible casualties, 60,000 casualties. We don't even give a thought to the fact that the French were attacking on that same day. So in support, alongside us, hand in hand. In fact, there's a memorial just up the street from where I am now in Flers, commemorating that hand-in-hand attack on the 1st of July in 1916. We don't mention it. We don't even think about it. When we're thinking of the 1st of July, we're thinking of the terrible British losses on that first day. So it's well worth remembering that they are here and fighting very hard, both in 1914 and in 1916.
And it wasn't something that the veterans themselves felt. The veterans always felt it was a very united British-French operation. The whole war was, and that's why we see at Thiepval, for example, the main memorial to the British missing on the Western Front, or in France at least. There is a joint French-Anglo cemetery beside the memorial to demonstrate that contribution. So again, I think it's important that we remember the French.
There's a whole story connected with that cemetery there, which we'll do on another podcast when we cover the Thiepval Memorial. So back on to the village and onwards walking in, and we cross over a little sunken lane. So there's a lane running left and right, both sunken. These lanes that are basically kind of sunken into the ground. There's no other way of saying it, really. And here it's very famous. For those that are interested in the village, is a battery of howitzers came galloping along this road that we are walking along, swung to the right into the sunken lane, unhitched their horses. The horses galloped back, those that remained, because quite a few had been killed on the way in. And 4.5-inch howitzers got into action very quickly in support of the infantry who are fighting on the far side of the village. So I always like to remember the artillery here. Very often when we're talking about the fighting of the First World War, we're thinking of the infantry, the man carrying his rifle and bayonet. And we don't very often stop to think about the artillery, who very often are in very close support to the infantry assaults. Onwards again into the village. A little bit of information. Population 250 or thereabouts at the moment, of which my family is part of that 250. I suspect that in fact, I know that prior to the Great War, the population had been considerably higher than that, and it will be in the rebuilding phase in the 30s. But after that, as the mechanisation of farming increases and people left, also public transport here is not brilliant, and I have to say, so people have slowly been leaving until just recently, and there is now a turnaround, and we're getting more people moving into the village, and the village is certainly on the up. A lot of the older properties being renovated, so it's nice to watch the increase and the village actually getting more life into it. So we then walk into the village, the true village itself, passing by my house, which is on the left-hand side, and in fact was a fortification for the Germans in 1916 during that 15th of September, and it was a strong point, and in fact a tank was dispatched to take out the strong point. So it's nothing left. There's not an article left, not a bunker, nothing to see. But I know that my house, or the remnants of my house, was being used as a strong point at that time. Then we walk a little zigzag in the village. It's the only kink in the road, and it was there in 1914, and it was put back. They didn't straighten the road out. They put everything back as it was, and into the heart of the village, and we're going to come to the village war memorial. Now, this is a war memorial just like in Britain or Australia or New Zealand or anywhere else around the empire. Every village, every town has a memorial commemorating those that went to war and didn't come back, and sometimes those that went to the war. So it's a listing of all the people that went to the war, and our village has a listing of all of those that died during the First World War, with an addition to the Second World War as well. And it's a French soldier with his rifle at the port, looking over his shoulder slightly, life size on a plinth just beside the church. So I'd recommend anybody to go and stop and just remember the people that left this village to fight. I always think about that, and sadly lost their lives. But what was it like for the guys that left the village to fight and came back at the end of the war to nothing? They must have thought, what have we been fighting for? My village is gone. There's nothing left.
I think it's extraordinary, Pete, that wherever you go in France, you see these wonderful town memorials, these community memorials to their missing soldiers. And as you say, those of us in Australia or the UK or New Zealand or other parts of the Commonwealth would understand what they represent, the boys that went off from that town and never came back. But I agree with you. I always think it's extraordinary when I'm in a village that is on the battlefields. And you imagine the French soldiers from that village, they're not fighting in that area. They're fighting probably 100 kilometres to the south in the French sector. And it must have been extraordinary during the fighting for them to know that their village and their family were caught up in this maelstrom of war, and to be thinking about what is going on in their home village. So you can be in Provence or Bordeaux or hundreds and hundreds of kilometres away from where the fighting actually was and still see these memorials to French soldiers who were killed. But imagine what it was like for those boys who came from the villages that are now being destroyed in the fighting.
Yeah, I think it's very moving. The other thing, of course, that you also see on the memorials here in the battle zones are the civilians that died. So they do actually list any civilians that died during the fighting. Now, it's difficult to unless you have a history of the village, to know when those civilians died, whether it's when the Germans first arrived or whether it was in the period when they're still here when we come back. Here, because the village was evacuated, I think, I'm not even sure we have actually any, to be truthful, whether we have any civilians on our village war memorial, but I think there's one, and almost certainly killed when the Germans first arrived. Some of the elderly and some of the very young didn't feel it was necessary to leave. When I say very young, I mean young teenagers who have not been called up and often left to try and look after the farm, to look after the cows if they're there. And it's some of those that sadly will lose their lives. But it's not that many, and I often it was something I used to say, and I don't say it any longer, that the Germans, didn't deliberately kill civilians in these battles. But of course, they had prior to this. In coming through Belgium, there'd been an awful lot of atrocities taken place, and one of the sadder aspects is the refugees that they rounded up in some of these villages as they evacuated them and fortified these villages. They put them into camps, and they didn't care for them very well, and there were big typhus epidemics that swept through them in the period when they're held within these camps, and so a lot of deaths. So it wasn't quite as pleasant as we imagine.
It's when I stand in front of these memorials, Pete, I think of the words that one of my historian comrades, it might even have been you, said to me. It was either you or Tom Morgan, I would imagine, another great battlefield historian that I enjoyed walking the battlefields with, but summed it up very neatly. The way that we choose to remember as nationalities, the way that we choose to remember the dead of the First World War, and it's not comprehensive, this assessment, but I think it gives a good overview. And the feeling is that when you go to a British cemetery and a Commonwealth cemetery, you see that to the British and Commonwealth soldiers, the loss of a soldier was a loss to his family. So his headstone emphasises individuality. There's messages from the family. The loss to the French is demonstrated that it was a loss to his community, which is why we often see these community memorials listing people from the village. And then when we go to the German cemeteries, we see that the loss of a German soldier was a loss to the fatherland. The German cemeteries are very stoic, collective, do not emphasise individuality in any great way, and emphasise the collective loss, which obviously reflects the way Germany was feeling at the end of the war when these cemeteries were put together. So I think these memorials tell a much bigger story than just merely what they represent in that village or what the names represent in that village.
It's interesting, we're not going to walk past it, but the village cemetery, which is behind the main road that we're walking down, Rue Principale is what we're walking down, the main road effectively. Well, the village cemetery actually has another memorial, and it's a duplicate of the memorial within the village beside the church, and it has the names again. And I often wonder, why have they done it twice? Well, I think that's very much part of that story, is they wanted them to be in the village cemetery as well. So their names are within the village cemetery, as well as being visible to everybody. They're visible privately to the people that go to the village cemetery. So I think it's an interesting concept, and I think you're absolutely right. It wasn't me, by the way. It must have been Tom that said this, but he's absolutely correct.
Well, if you're listening, Tom, thank you for letting me borrow that phrase, because it sums it up so neatly, and I've used it many times on the battlefields. And I think, especially when you're standing in a stark German cemetery, it helps make a lot of sense. But back to Fleur.
Yep.
Where are we heading now, Pete?
So the church is on the right-hand side. This is a rebuilt church. It's similar. It's certainly not a replica of what was here before. And that's an interesting concept that the French didn't attempt, as perhaps the best example would be Germany after the Second World War. It rebuilt a lot of its ancient buildings, were rebuilt exactly as they had been. But in France, then it's similar, but it wasn't felt the need to actually reproduce exactly what had been there before. So it's similar size, but different. I don't know if I can describe it. It's actually quite odd. It's got the signs of the zodiac over the door, which I always feel is quite odd for a church, but that's what it has, the signs of the zodiac over the door. Beside the door to the church, on the left-hand side, we have another two new memorials, and they're new that they were built on the centenary, or inaugurated on the centenary of the fighting in the September of 1916, and they are commemorating the 17th Battalion of the Middlesex Regiment, which is known as the Footballers Battalion. They have a memorial there. That was unveiled on the 10th of July in 2016. And then we have a New Zealand memorial in steel, which is the fern leaf cut into the steel. And that commemorates the New Zealanders fighting here. So those are both new memorials. And it's an interesting concept, I suppose, or an interesting comment, not a concept, interesting comment that we are still building memorials. 100 years after the fighting, we are still putting memorials up on the village. And I suppose what's more interesting, or within the villages, is that the villages are allowing it, because they don't have to. The mayor can say, no, don't be so stupid, I'm not having a memorial put up here 100 years after the fighting. But here we have two new memorials put up on the centenaries of the fighting and beside the church, and very much looked after by the villagers themselves, by the mayor and his committee, and always have flowers on them at every commemorative event, the 11th of November being probably the biggest one. And so it's part of the village. They are very much aware of what went on in this area and the need to commemorate it.
It's a fascinating concept, Pete, and I don't want to wander off too much on a tangent here, but it is something I'm fairly passionate about. The concept of new memorials. The veterans are all gone. The memorials that were put up in the immediate post-war years, or even several decades later, were primarily designed and built for the veterans who had fought there, so they had somewhere to come and remember, or so that they would not be forgotten. Now, obviously, those veterans are all gone, but we still have this compelling need to remember. And I'm in two minds about it. I'll be completely honest. I'm in two minds about it. I think some of the new memorials that are going up are absolutely excellent and fill a gap for modern visitors. And there are now many more visitors coming to the battlefields than probably in any time in history. And so some of the new memorials do fill gaps and make sure that important parts of the battlefields are not overlooked. But some of them, being totally frank, are absolutely awful. And we could list them all. The biggest atrocity, of course, is the one I always mention, is the terrible animal memorial and the memorial park being privately constructed at Pozières, and in my opinion, completely obliterating one of the most important Australian battlefields with absolute tat. And that's actually me being diplomatic. If you've heard me making other comments about it, you'll see what I'm talking about. But go and jump on the web and just have a look at that monstrosity that is blighting the battlefield at Pozières. Again, well-meaning people, but they are completely misguided and they are destroying the battlefield by erecting memorials all over it. And other ones like it's interesting you mentioned a football memorial, because football for some reason has become indelibly linked with the First World War. The stories of the Christmas truce and the game of football that may or may not have been played during the Christmas truce in 1914. There is UEFA, the International Soccer Federation, has now built its own memorial up in Belgium, which again is pretty awful. More as a marketing attempt to promote the game of football, I believe, than any sort of legitimate effort to remember. But it's fascinating, and I think sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes new memorials say a lot more about us than they do about the men who actually fought there.
I think that's.
I've sort of hung you out to dry a bit there, Pete. I've pretty controversial what I've said. I'll invite you to either be the voice of reason or to back me up on that one.
No, I'm backing you up, I'm afraid. I think it's interesting. I have to say the two memorials that I've just been discussing in the village are discreet, and where they are works very well. If they were elsewhere, I'm not sure that I would be so keen on them. But they do the job very well where they are. But you're absolutely right, there are some absolute horrors. I think we could do a podcast on horrors on the battlefield, recent horrors on the battlefield. Not the horrors of the fighting, the horrors of building memorials, because there are some absolute shockers. And it's ongoing, and I have to say, that is one of the we could do a podcast on about it. How do we feel about memorials being built? Which leads on nicely to my next subject, which is the 41st Divisional Memorial within the village. So we carry on walking up the main street, and we can see it very clearly in front of us. It's the village square, which actually is odd because it's not in the centre of the village. It's more on the far side of the village to where I live. But it's got a beautiful memorial to the 41st Division. The 41st Division was the division that actually took the village on the 15th of September, along with the tanks of D Company and the New Zealanders. New Zealand Division fighting on the left-hand side, and then actually moving into the village itself to support the 41st Division. So the 41st Division decided to build this beautiful depiction of a soldier in fighting order, larger than life, on top of another plinth. It is, in my view, one of the best memorials on the Western Front, only really surpassed by the brand new memorial, and again a beautiful memorial of a Scottish soldier fighting, this is just outside Ypres, fighting at Black Watch Corner, which is at Polygon Wood, and I'm sure I think we've already covered it, but if we haven't, we will be covering that Scottish soldier and his story. And again, I put a little point on my notes here. How did the French feel about the building of this memorial? And I have to say, it's not common to have a depiction of a British soldier, certainly a fighting British soldier in all of his paraphernalia. You don't see too many of that type of memorial. Very often the memorials are just obelisks. So I'm not sure whether we were not keen or whether the French, which had their say about what they liked and what they didn't like, whether they were not that keen on depictions of British soldiers. But here he is in the centre of the village, and he's I've known him all of my life in one way or another, because one of the early books that I bought when I very first became interested in the First World War by Rose Coombs, and he's emblazoned on the front of it, and it's still it's still been published, multiple updates. So the most recent, in fact, has a photograph that I took, a colour photograph on the front of the memorial. So he is an image that I think is a very, very successful imagery of this, or successful, that's not a very good word. It's an image that I like, and I think would one that a lot of people who are interested in the First World War would recognise.
It's well said, Pete, and before we move on from the subject of memorials, I should just clarify my earlier comments as well, to just say that many of the memorials are very thoughtful and well placed and contribute a lot to the battlefields, and particularly the New Zealand memorials, because for some inexplicable reason New Zealand was poorly represented. I think it's the Kiwis, the way they like to do things is they're always understated, and even their memorials, were quite understated on the Western Front. So I think it's great, some of the New Zealand memorials that are popping up. Other ones, not so sure about. But you're right, the 41st Division Memorial is absolutely spectacular.
Just an interesting comment here, because of the New Zealanders fighting here. They did have a cross. We're going to walk towards it, and it's really almost where our walk will finish, a little place called Factory Corner. And that's where they originally placed a memorial cross there. Now, that memorial cross slowly deteriorated, and by the mid-20s it was decided it wasn't really suitable, and they decided, as well, the New Zealand government decided to place their permanent memorial elsewhere. In fact, it's on the ridge just behind me, where we are now, standing in the middle of the village, looking. If we were to look behind where we've just come from, the ridge behind us, that's where the New Zealand Memorial is. A little known fact is that the cross that was there was actually burnt, and they decided to destroy it, and they burnt it, but they gathered up the ashes from the cross and they scattered them on the graves of New Zealand soldiers who had died fighting in the area. And that's very moving that they thought it through, and that was actually the Imperial War Graves that thought it through, that was the right thing to do with this cross as they destroyed a memorial that was no longer required. Okay, so we're going to now turn right at this memorial, at the 41st Divisional Memorial. We're going to do a little detour instead of walking straight out through the village, and we're going to head to a little cemetery. And I have to say I'm biased because it's within our village, or my village, and it's Bulls Road Cemetery. Beautiful little cemetery, one of the smaller cemeteries on the Western Front, tucked into a bank, which is exactly why it's there, because it is a battlefield cemetery. There was a casualty clearing station there, and so people were being buried there on their evacuation route, and then it's going to be used as a concentration cemetery. So it's a lovely cemetery, cross of sacrifice standing out. I photograph it an awful lot, go there in all sorts of different weather to get a good view of it. There's almost two phases to it. One of them is an upper area, which is almost exclusively Australian. And those are the Australians that were holding the line here at the period of the winter of 1916-17. So it's actually from the October onwards, October to the Germans withdraw to the Hindenburg Line in the March of 1917. And they were burying their dead who were dying in this area there, on this raised area. And then, after the Germans withdrew to the Hindenburg Line, it's the first time we have an attempt to clear the battlefield. And so we have the lower section, soldiers who were recovered and then moved into a concentration cemetery. And that concentration will continue on till after the war as well. The cemetery itself was designed by Sir Herbert Baker, and he's the guy that will design Tyncott, the largest Commonwealth War Graves cemetery in the world. So he's one of the greater designers of the cemeteries of the First World War.
So, Pete, tell us some of the stories of the men who are buried in this cemetery.
Well, I think to me, I like looking at the average man, the Joe Bloggs who's buried in the cemetery. There's obviously the great and good in most of these cemeteries, but it's a personal story, and it's about one of my, I think, probably the second visit to Australia. And we went to an area known as Kangaroo Valley, quite close to where my brother lives, and there's a little museum there. We went in, and straight away we saw this inscription to a chap called George Ditton. And George Ditton is buried here in the cemetery here, and just reading his story and knowing more about him brings him home. And he's a very small chap. He was rejected twice when he tried to enlist because he was 5'2", and he must have walked around the block and managed to stand on his tippy toes because he eventually got accepted and joined up. He joined his battalion on the 18th of January. And sadly, on the 20th of January, he was actually killed. So he survived for 2 days in the front line. That's all. All of that expectation, all of that effort to get in. 45th Battalion was the battalion that he served with. And sadly, he's there for 2 days. Most of the chaps that were with him wouldn't have even known his name. It's just so moving to go and sit beside him. And 24 years old, 2 days service on the front line.
Absolutely extraordinary. It's those stories that just grab you, don't they? This is why we're interested in this history. People often ask me why I'm so intrigued with these stories of war, and to me, it's the personal stories. It's not about generals and tactics and strategy, although that is an important part of it. But it's those personal stories that just grip you and just fascinate you every time. And there's so many of them. And we could study this for a century, another century on from now, and we will never learn all of these individual stories. They're just absolutely extraordinary. That's a great one that I hadn't heard before. Just very, very moving.
I think what's interesting is in the particular time that we're living in at the moment, I'm restricted now to where I can go, and I can only actually walk 1 kilometre in any direction from where I live. And so I can only hit 2 cemeteries. I can only get to 2 cemeteries. So interestingly, it's made me look more carefully at the cemetery at Bulls Road, and I've actually started looking at the individual stories of those that are buried within the cemetery, and it's just fascinating. They've all got stories. There's a story connected to every one. I mean, you could write half a dozen books just about the men in this one cemetery. So I suppose what I better do is give you the numbers of how many people there are buried in the cemetery here at Bulls Road. So we have 776 burials or commemorations of men who may not be in the cemetery, but they're commemorated there, of which 296 are unknown. And that's mainly because of this concentration effort to bring bodies in later on into the cemetery. And very often we don't know who these guys are that are actually brought in.
It's a relatively high proportion of known burials, isn't it? And I think that reflects probably the fact that it was a casualty clearing station, and therefore the men that came in were fairly well documented when they arrived, as opposed to some of these battlefield cemeteries right in the front line where they weren't keeping as good a track of the bodies that they were bringing in, or indeed the concentration cemeteries where they were clearing the battlefields years after the war.
Yeah, that's correct. And in fact, of the Australians that are commemorated here, the 155 Australians, the majority of them are actually known. And that is because they died and were buried at the time and not gathered in later on. So it's one of those typical cemeteries of the Western Front, a mix of battlefield burials and concentration and guys that were died on the evacuation route.
The interesting thing for our Australian listeners is that the majority of the Australians in these cemeteries were killed during the winter, as we've mentioned, of 1617. And there was a couple of actions that occurred here, which are, I think rather grandly known as the Battle of Flers, which are remembered very strongly in Australia, as distinctly from the fighting that occurred earlier here in the Somme fighting. But we should cover that, Pete, in a future podcast. It would be great to walk that ground around these trenches and the maze and Guardacourt and some of these places where they weren't huge actions, but they were also the scene of some of the greatest misery for Australian soldiers during the First World War, just because of the conditions during that awful winter of 1916-17.
I think it's interesting, and no doubt I'll talk about it when we do actually do a podcast covering that area. But it's well worth thinking about that. It was remembered fairly well in Australia because the dioramas in the War Memorial, one of them depicts that winter. It's not depicting an attack. It is just depicting men suffering in terrible weather and winter conditions in trenches when they haven't actually got the correct amount of clothing, and there was a shortage of almost everything. So it was something that deserves to be remembered, and certainly I'd look forward to doing a podcast covering the attacks that took place at that period. One of the most famous being on the 5th of November, 1916, right at the end of the Battle of the Somme.
And Pete, something you've mentioned to me before, which I think would be great to discuss with anyone listening here, is the Long Tunnel, because this is connected with Bulls Road Cemetery. Just talk to me about this.
Yeah, it's a fascinating aspect, mainly because it's still not known exactly what it is. There's a very famous book by a chap called Trevor Pidgeon, who wrote about the tanks fighting here. And he heard the rumours that there was a very long tunnel, the entrance of which was supposed to be somewhere close to the cemetery, which ran along that bank that we've been, as we walked into the village, the bank on the right-hand side, and was ridiculously about 1 kilometre long. And he kind of poo-poos it. He thinks, no, I'm not sure it actually, I can't find any proof of it. I don't think he would then, at that period when he was writing his book, have access, as we do nowadays, to be able to look online at battalion diaries, Australian battalion diaries, because over and over in those diaries for the units that were there is comments about the long tunnel, the chalk tunnel, the accommodation in the chalk tunnel. And it's always Bulls Road and where the cemetery now is that they are discussing. So I'm fairly certain that there was a tunnel there. In fact, not fairly certain. There definitely was a tunnel there. How big it was, how long it was. But certainly I found accounts of almost whole battalions being within, and that's 1,000 men being within these tunnel complexes or this long tunnel. So I think it's fascinating, and I'd love to go and find the entrance and have a rummage in there. But we don't know exactly where it was. I'll just tell you a final little story because it is so fascinating. Google Earth, when it first came out, a lot of us were really pleased, the people that walk and look at the battlefields, because here we have an opportunity to look down on the landscape from above. Well, roughly where the tunnel is supposed to be, you can see these little white dots going right the way along where it should be. And there's obviously something growing in the crops or something changing the crops where these white dots are. And I think it's breather holes. I think it's breather holes for the tunnel. I'm only guessing. I've looked recently and you can't see them now because they're using a different picture. I believe you can go back in history and look at earlier pictures of Google Earth. But I think it's fascinating that it may exist. It may be there.
Well, that would be a great discovery for the future if you uncover that, Pete. So that will imagine that podcast after that discovery. Where are we heading next on the walk?
Okay, so the view that we get from, that's one of the great things about Bulls Road Cemetery. It's slightly elevated, so you can actually look towards the front line. And from Bulls Road Cemetery, we can see right the way up a little track, and it's the track we're going to walk. And it's called Grass Lane. My northern accent makes that little, I'm going to try it again, Grass Lane. So we're walking up Grass Lane. That leads us to the front line. So we're fairly close to the front line of that winter of 1617, perhaps a kilometre or less away, 800 metres maybe, to the front line. So we're going to walk towards it along this grass lane. And all the time we're walking along it, in front of us, we can see yet another cemetery. And this is the second cemetery that I can just about reach in my kilometre walk. This cemetery is called the AIF Cemetery, Grass Lane. So it's a very unusual cemetery. It's the only one on the whole of the Western Front that uses the name AIF, Australian Imperial Forces. And I think its proper title is the Australian Imperial Forces Burial Ground Flers. That is its actual proper title, but most people just know it as the AIF Cemetery. So immediately you think, well, this must have been a cemetery that is just full of Australians. Well, actually it's not, because it is in the main an enormous concentration cemetery, and it's one of the biggest ones in the area here. And they are concentrating men from right across the battlefield, all the way to Beaumont Hamel on the other side of the battlefield. We have soldiers buried within this cemetery. Another beautiful cemetery, also designed by Sir Herbert Baker. And I like his designs. I think he's a very good designer of cemeteries. I like his rubble walls that he builds and the coping stones of Jurassic limestone on the top. It's a beautiful cemetery.
And how many people are buried here, Pete? Because it's the number of times I've been to this cemetery and just overwhelmed almost by the sheer number of burials in this spot.
Well, this is a whopper. So 3,475 men are buried or commemorated within the cemetery. But the shocking thing is 2,263 of those men, we don't know who they are. We also have 170 French soldiers. So again, we get this French connection who are buried within the cemetery, and 3 Germans. We actually have 3 Germans here as well. Now, interestingly, if you read in the splurb, in the cemetery booklet, it says started by Australian medical units based nearby in November of 1916. I just don't believe that. I think it's extraordinary if that's true, because it is almost right in the front line, and it's very, very visible from the German frontline positions. I think there's a bit of a confusion between Bulls Road and this cemetery. If there were burials here, they would be tucked into the bank, because again, there was a little quarry here, tucked into the bank, and it wouldn't be many. It would just be so difficult to bury people here so close to the front line. And in fact, walking up and down the cemetery, I can find no grouping that looks like it's an original battlefield cemetery where you'd get scattered graves, not nice, neat lines. There's none of that. So I'm not sure, but that certainly is what is in the booklet. It says that it was begun in the November of 1916.
We did a fascinating podcast a year or so ago, Pete, on my Living History podcast channel about the cemeteries of the Western Front, and I'd suggest that people go and listen to that. Because it tells just an amazing story about the creation of these cemeteries in the post-war years, the different types of cemeteries, the way that when you visit a cemetery, you can tell the story of what went on around there just by the layouts of the graves or noting the dates on the headstones. So if you haven't listened to that, go and check out that podcast on my Living History channel, because you'll hear Pete Smith and me talking all about those fascinating stories that these cemeteries can tell.
It's one of my favourite, favourite subjects are the creation of the cemeteries, the movement of the dead, trying to identify them. It's really fascinating, and certainly there's a lot more work needs doing. And thankfully, we have a lot of historians who are writing books about this period and what went on. I think one of the most recent ones that I've enjoyed reading, and I can't remember the author, you'll have to forgive me, but it's about the photographic teams who are also going around taking photographs of the graves as they were originally being created with their wooden crosses. And I think that's another fascinating story.
It certainly is. It's one of the aspects of the battlefields that's most important, I would say, because when we visit the battlefields, we are looking for tangible connections with the history, and there's nothing more tangible than seeing the graves of the men who were killed in fighting in that area, and they will remain there. It doesn't matter long after the trenches are gone and long after every trace of the war has disappeared from the landscape. Those men will still be there as a testament to what went on. So the cemeteries are a vitally important aspect of commemorating this history on the battlefields, and something that I recommend everyone should spend as much time in as they can when they walk the ground.
I think you're right, and it's interesting. I do occasionally, when I'm guiding clients around the battlefield, I do get comments from people saying, "Oh, not another cemetery," and I normally take them aside and say, "It's not just about the cemetery; it's about learning the stories of the people that are buried within the cemetery." But there's nothing, I suppose, more important than actually going to where these guys that fought and died for us are buried. And yes, in this walk, we're covering the two facets: the memorials, the landscape, and the cemeteries. But the cemeteries are an integral part of the battlefields, and I think it's absolutely crucial that you go to as many as you can, and don't be bored by them, because there are stories within them. It's learning the stories.
Very well said, and AIF Burial Ground is an absolute highlight, especially if you're an Australian or indeed a British listener. There are some wonderful stories in that cemetery. Where to next, Pete?
So that really brings the walk to its end now. We can look back from this point, from the AIF Burial Ground. We can look back to the village. You can see the church standing out and the trees within the village. And I just wanted to talk finally really about the rebuilding of the village and what was that process that took place. How did that come about? Well, the village had gone. There was nothing here. So you have to imagine, first of all, you need surveyors to figure out where everything was. One of the things they did was to clear the rubble and what was left. And in fact, it was quite handy in a way, I suppose. There are trenches and shell holes and the ground ripples. So effectively, they took the rubble, that remained from the village, and they scraped it into the shell holes and the trenches, hence levelling the ground ready for reconstruction. They then rebuilt the houses, and this will take to 1927, the date of my house. Around about that time is when we get up to the roofs are going on and people are coming back. In fact, people were back well before that, because what they're living in are the wooden shacks and huts that were used by the troops. They were dismantled from the rear areas and brought into these red zone, the zone reds, the destroyed areas, and used for accommodation for the people as they're rebuilding. Then they had temporary huts that were a bit more substantial built. And eventually we get the houses. And in fact, on my property, I used to have, sadly, one part has gone, but I used to have all three phases. The wooden hut was here. Sadly, it was in next door's garden, and he demolished it while we were moving in, which was a shame. And then we had the earlier house, a very small house that was built. And the farmer himself told me that he came back, but his wife didn't come back until the big house was built. So he came back with his son, and they carried on clearing the battlefields, because, of course, they have to get the fields under the plough again. And then when the big house was built, then his wife came back here. So where was this being financed from? Well, it's being financed by the French, as you'd expect. But there was an attempt in the very early years after the war, before the Big Depression, of twinning with British cities. So this village is actually twinned with Portsmouth, which may seem unusual. Anybody that knows England, Portsmouth is an enormous great seaport. So what on earth is the connection between the small village of Flers and the big seaport, the big city of Portsmouth in Britain? And it's because their volunteer battalion, their PALS battalion of the Hampshire Regiment, the Portsmouth, 2nd Portsmouth PALS, basically fought here. They fought in the village on that 15th of September, fighting when the village was retaken. So that's where the twinning came from, and the whole idea was that we would actually help pay for the rebuilding of these villages. Sadly, the Depression came along and the whole concept slowly collapsed. But yet it's still remembered that within the village hall here, the Mary, in fact, where the mayor hangs out, there is an inscription that commemorates the fact that we are twinned with Portsmouth in Britain.
Well, Pete, it's been an absolutely wonderful journey through your hometown in France, so thank you very much for sharing it with us. As I said at the start of this interview, I'm really looking forward to exploring these less well-known chapters of the First World War, and particularly these places where so much amazing history unfolded, yet most people don't know much about it. So just thank you so much for sharing with this amazing story with us, and for walking through the village with me today.
It's been very enjoyable, and it's nice to talk about the village where I live.